I was sitting in the airplane cabin, trying to get comfortable. The cramped economy seat, people bustling around, the smell of cheap coffee, and the hum of the engines. These were almost familiar by now. After each deployment, returning home through airports had become part of my routine. I was a soldier, just back from a conflict zone. My mind was tired, but my heart was at ease. Finally, I was home. Finally, it was all over. Or so I thought. As I approached my seat, I saw that it was already occupied. A white man in his 40s was lounging in the seat as if he owned the plane. His legs were stretched out in front of him, his elbows resting on both armrests. He didn't acknowledge my presence until I stopped right in front of him. "Excuse me," I started, keeping my tone polite, despite the irritation simmering beneath the surface. "I believe you're in my seat." He looked up from his newspaper, barely lifting his eyes to meet mine, and then glanced back down dismissively. "I don't see your name on it," he said, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a moment, I was stunned by the sheer audacity. I had seen plenty of disrespect in my time, but this was different. This was casual, effortless, as if he was used to getting his way. My military training kicked in. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. There was no need to escalate things. "I'm sure it's just a mistake," I said, showing him my boarding pass. "23B, this is my seat." He sighed dramatically, as if I were the one inconveniencing him. "Listen, soldier," he said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound like an insult. "I paid for extra legroom. They screwed up my booking, and I'm not moving. You military guys think you can get everything handed to you. Well, not today." I felt my patience wearing thin. I had just returned from a place where real battles were fought, where lives were on the line, and here was this man, acting like he was entitled to anything he wanted, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. The flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. She smiled apologetically at me before turning to the man. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to your assigned seat," she said. "No," he snapped, not even looking up. "I'm staying right here." The flight attendant glanced back at me, helplessness in her eyes. I nodded slightly, signaling that I could handle it. I leaned in closer to the man, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "Look, I've had a long tour. I just want to sit down and get home. I'm not looking for trouble." He folded his newspaper with an air of finality and leaned back, closing his eyes. "Then go find another seat," he said, his tone dismissive. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. I could make a scene, demand my seat, but that would only give him more power. No, I needed a different approach, something that would put him in his place without giving him the upper hand. And then it came to me, a plan so simple, it was brilliant. I slid into the empty seat next to him, invading his space, making him uncomfortable. I started talking quietly at first, so only he could hear. I told him about the war, about the things I had seen, the things I had done. My voice was calm, but the stories were horrifying. I spoke of gunfire in the night, of friends lost, of enemies seen through the scope. As I talked, I noticed him shifting uncomfortably, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. By the time I finished my third story, detailing the time I had been trapped behind enemy lines, he was visibly sweating. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly around the newspaper he no longer pretended to read. He glanced at me, fear flickering in his eyes, and then stood up abruptly, moving to the back of the plane. I watched him go, a small smile playing on my lips. I had won, not through force, but through the weight of my experiences. As I settled into my seat, I felt a sense of satisfaction. But the atmosphere around me was tense. Passengers had overheard my stories. They knew I was not just another passenger. They looked at me with a mix of respect and fear. I closed my eyes, trying to let the hum of the plane lull me to sleep. But then, out of nowhere, a passenger stood up and started handing out tiny plastic medals that said, "For bravery in flight." Each medal had a duck's head wearing a crown on it. It was so absurd, so out of place, that I couldn't help but laugh. There, in the air, surrounded by strangers, I realized just how surreal my life had become. The reality I once knew was crumbling, replaced by this bizarre, unpredictable new world. But if this was the new game, I was ready to play. The plane landed, and I stepped out, hoping to leave the tension behind. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the tarmac, and for a moment, I felt at peace. My mind drifted back to the war, to the comrades I had left behind, and the new battle I seemed to have started on this flight. I thought about the man, Ted, and his pale face as he walked away. A part of me felt satisfied. Another part felt uneasy. As I walked through the airport, I noticed the eyes on me. Some were curious, others wary. It wasn't unusual for a black man in uniform to attract attention, but this felt different. The stories I had told on the plane weren't just heard by Ted. They had reached the ears of everyone around. I hadn't planned it, but I had stirred the pot. Making my way to the baggage claim, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A woman with a camera phone whispered to her friend, her eyes darting to me. A man in a suit stood too close, pretending to check his phone. I felt the invisible walls closing in, a familiar sense of being trapped. I knew I needed to stay calm, keep my cool, but a storm was brewing, and I was right in its path. As I reached for my bag, a man stepped in front of me, blocking my path. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a sharp suit and an expression that was all business. "Marcus, right?" he asked, his tone clipped. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, can I help you?" He extended a hand. "Dan Simmons, I work with the airline's security team. We've had a report of a disturbance on your flight. Mind coming with me to discuss it?" A disturbance? My heart skipped a beat. I had expected Ted to make a fuss, maybe even try to file a complaint, but security? This was more than I had bargained for. I followed Dan, my mind racing. I replayed the events in my head, wondering what angle Ted had taken, what accusations he might have made. Dan led me to a small office, closing the door behind us. He sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "We've had a passenger file a complaint against you," he said, opening a file on his desk. "He claims you threatened him, that you're a danger to the other passengers. We take these matters seriously." I felt a cold anger settling in my chest. "He took my seat," I said, keeping my voice level. "I didn't threaten him. I told him stories, true stories. He didn't like what he heard, and he got scared. That's not my fault." Dan looked at me, his eyes narrowing. And what kind of stories were these? I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. Stories about war, about the things we do for this country, about the things people like him never have to face. For a moment, there was silence. Then Dan nodded, closing the file. "I believe you, Marcus," he said, "but the airline wants this handled quietly. We can't afford bad press. We need to find a way to settle this." I sat back, considering my options. I could fight this, push back against Ted's lies, or I could play along, find a way to turn this to my advantage. I had learned a lot about strategy on the battlefield, and this was no different. I needed to think like a soldier. "All right," I said slowly. "What do you propose?" Dan smiled, leaning back in his chair. "We compensate the passenger, make a public statement that you're a decorated soldier who was misunderstood. We spin this as a misunderstanding, maybe even a hero's tale. We protect the airline's reputation, and you walk away without any trouble." A hero's tale? I almost laughed. They wanted to turn this into a PR stunt, use my service as a shield. I looked at Dan, weighing my words. "And what do I get out of this?" He raised an eyebrow. "What do you want?" I thought about it. Ted had tried to take something from me, something more than just a seat. He had tried to take my dignity. I wanted to take something from him. "I want an apology," I said finally, "a public apology, and I want him banned from flying with this airline again. He's a liability." Dan hesitated, then nodded. I think we can make that happen. Some called me a hero, praising my service, while others labeled me a bully, accusing me of using my status to intimidate an innocent passenger. It was chaos, and I was caught in the middle of it. I never wanted this. All I wanted was to go home in peace. But now I was the center of a storm. I sat in my small apartment, staring at the screen of my laptop. Comment sections filled with vitriol scrolled by, people arguing about me, a stranger to most of them. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, friends, family, even old comrades reaching out, some offering support, others questioning my actions. It was overwhelming. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt even on the battlefield. The next day, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, holding a microphone and a notepad. She had the polished look of a TV reporter, sharp eyes, calculated smile. "Marcus?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm Sarah Jenkins from Channel 8 News. Do you have a minute to talk about what happened on your flight?" I hesitated. Risota, part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to shut out the world and all its noise. But another part of me knew this was an opportunity. If people were going to talk about me, they should at least hear my side of the story. I stepped aside, letting her in. We sat at my kitchen table, the camera crew setting up around us. Sarah started with easy questions, my background, my service, the basics. But soon enough, she turned to the flight, to Ted. "What do you have to say to those who accuse you of using your military status to intimidate another passenger?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I didn't use my status," I said. "I used my voice. I told my story. If that made him uncomfortable, maybe he should think about why. People need to understand that soldiers are not just symbols. We're people with experiences that change us, shape us. I was just asking for respect." She nodded, scribbling in her notepad. "And what about the airline's statement? They've painted this as a misunderstanding, a simple disagreement. Do you agree with that?" I felt a surge of anger. "No," I said firmly. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power play. Ted thought he could take what he wanted because of who he is, and when he couldn't, he tried to play the victim. That's not a misunderstanding. That's entitlement." The interview aired that night, and the response was immediate. Some praised my honesty, saying it was refreshing to hear a soldier speak out. Others accused me of playing the victim, trying to gain sympathy. It didn't matter what I said. People heard what they wanted to hear. But the real twist came the next morning. I was getting ready for a run when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen and froze. There it was, a video of Ted taken by another passenger on the flight. In it, Ted was laughing, bragging to the people around him about how he had put that soldier in his place. He mocked my stories, calling me a crybaby, saying he could handle more than any soldier could. The video spread like wildfire, turning the public opinion on its head. Suddenly, Ted was the villain, and I was vindicated. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger, darker. It was a fight for the truth, but the truth was slippery, elusive, and I was starting to wonder if anyone could really hold on to it. The video of Ted had turned the tide in my favor. People were now looking at him as the villain, and for a moment, it felt good to be vindicated. But that moment was brief. The next day, I found myself back in the media circus, with reporters camped outside my apartment, hungry for more. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. It was overwhelming, and I felt exposed, like a raw nerve. Amid the chaos, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another reporter, but something made me pick up. "Marcus?" a voice asked. It was calm, measured, with a hint of authority. "This is Lisa Morrison. I work for the American Veterans Association. I saw your story, and I think we should talk." I was wary. "Talk about what?" "About making a difference," she said. about using your platform to highlight the real issues veterans face. I believe we can help each other." I hesitated. I wasn't looking to become a spokesperson, but maybe this was an opportunity. Maybe I could turn this mess into something meaningful. "All right," I said finally. "Let's talk." We met at a small cafe, far from the eyes of the media. Lisa was a tall woman with sharp eyes and an air of confidence. She got straight to the point. "You've become a symbol, Marcus," she said, leaning forward. "People are listening to you. We can use that to bring attention to the struggles veterans face: discrimination, mental health issues, lack of support. We can make a difference." I listened, intrigued. "And what's in it for you?" I asked. She smiled. "We get a voice, we get attention, and we get to help people like you who've served their country and deserve better." I thought about it. This wasn't what I had planned, but maybe it was the right thing to do. Maybe I could use this chaos to shine a light on the darkness. Over the next few days, Lisa and I worked together to create a campaign. We wanted to show the world what life was really like for veterans. We gathered stories, testimonies, statistics. We painted a picture that was raw, honest, and impossible to ignore. The response was immediate. People were listening, donating, getting involved. It was more than I had expected, and for the first time in a while, I felt a sense of purpose. But not everyone was happy. Ted's supporters, those who saw me as a threat to their way of life, began to lash out. I started receiving hate mail, threats, messages telling me to go back to where I came from. It was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off. I had faced worse on the battlefield. One evening, as I was leaving the cafe after another meeting with Lisa, I noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. A man watching me. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning with hatred. I walked faster, my heart pounding, but he didn't follow. It was a warning, a sign that this fight was far from over. The next day, I received a message from an anonymous number. It was a link to a video. I hesitated, then clicked. My stomach turned as I watched. It was footage from a security camera, showing me and Lisa at the cafe discussing our plans, but the video had been edited, spliced together to make it seem like we were plotting something sinister. The captions painted us as radicals, extremists. It was a setup, a deliberate attempt to discredit us. I showed the video to Lisa, and she frowned. "This is bad," she said. "They're trying to turn public opinion against us." "What do we do?" I asked. "We fight back," she said, her eyes steely. "We expose this for what it is, a smear campaign. We show the world the truth." But I wasn't so sure. This was different from the battle with Ted. This was a war of perception, a battle for the hearts and minds of the public. And in this war, truth was just another weapon, one that could be twisted and turned. We decided to go public, to hold a press conference and address the allegations head-on. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing. I stood at the podium, my heart pounding, and began to speak. I talked about the video, about the lies, about the real issues we were fighting for. But as I spoke, I saw the looks in the eyes of the reporters. Doubt, suspicion. It was clear some of them didn't believe me. The days following the press conference were a blur of interviews, meetings, and planning sessions. Lisa and I were determined to keep the momentum going, to fight back against the lies and keep pushing for change. We were a team, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a partner I could rely on. Someone who understood the fight, who was willing to go to battle with me. But as the pressure mounted, I started to notice cracks in our alliance. Lisa was spending more time on the phone, having hushed conversations with people I didn't know. She was becoming more secretive, more distant. At first, I chalked it up to stress. After all, we were both under intense scrutiny. But a nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't let go. Something was off. One evening, I decided to confront her. We met at the cafe, the same place where we had planned our campaign. It felt like a lifetime ago. I watched her across the table, searching her eyes for answers. "Lisa, is everything okay?" I asked. "You've been acting different." She looked up, startled. What do you mean? I mean, you're not telling me everything. I can feel it. If we're going to keep doing this, I need to know you've got my back. She hesitated, biting her lip. Of course I do, Marcus. I'm just dealing with some things. Personal stuff. It has nothing to do with our work. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the doubt was there, creeping into the corners of my mind. Trust is fragile, and mine was starting to crack. A week later, my worst fears were confirmed. I was working late in my apartment, sifting through emails, when I stumbled upon a message that wasn't meant for me. It was from one of Lisa's contacts, a man named Greg. I recognized his name from some of our meetings, but what caught my attention was the subject line, Ari, Marcus situation. I opened the email, my hands shaking. The message was brief, but it said everything I needed to know. Lisa, we need to control the narrative. Marcus is a loose cannon. If he finds out about the deal, it could ruin everything. Keep him in line, or we'll have to cut him loose. I stared at the screen, disbelief washing over me. A deal? Control the narrative? What the hell was going on? I felt a surge of anger, betrayal burning in my chest. Lisa had been playing me. She was using me, just like everyone else. I had trusted her, and she had sold me out. I stood up, pacing the room. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts spinning. What was the deal? Who else was involved? I needed answers, and I needed them now. The next day, I went to Lisa's office. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I barged in, slamming the door behind me. What the hell is this? I demanded, holding up my phone with the email. Lisa looked up, her face pale. For a moment, she said nothing, just stared at me with those sharp eyes. Then she sighed, leaning back in her chair. Marcus, I can explain. Explain? You've been lying to me, using me. What's the deal, Lisa? What have you been hiding? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. It's not what you think. We're trying to secure funding for the campaign, to keep it going. Greg offered a deal, support in exchange for control over the message. I was going to tell you, but what? I snapped. You thought I'd just go along with it? You thought you could control me like a puppet? She stood up, her voice rising. I was trying to protect you, Marcus. You're too close to this, too emotional. I needed to make sure we could keep fighting, that we wouldn't lose everything. I laughed bitterly. Protect me? You're just like Ted. You don't care about the truth, about what's right. You care about power, control. You're no different from the people we're fighting against. There was a moment of silence, heavy and cold. Then Lisa spoke, her voice low. You're right, Marcus. Maybe I am like them, but this is the world we live in. You either play the game or you get played. You wanted to make a difference. Well, this is how it's done. I turned away, disgusted. I had fought for my country, for justice, for truth. And here I was, surrounded by lies, betrayal, and corruption. I felt sick, the room spinning around me. I had thought Lisa was my ally, but she was just another enemy in disguise. After my confrontation with Lisa, I felt lost, adrift in a sea of betrayal. I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. I needed to know more about this deal she mentioned, about Greg, about who was really pulling the strings. I couldn't sit back and let them manipulate me. I had to take control of the narrative. I spent days combing through emails, phone records, anything I could get my hands on. It was tedious, soul-crushing work, but I was determined. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. I discovered that Greg was connected to several high-profile donors, people with money and influence, people who could make or break a campaign. They had been funding Lisa's efforts, using her to push their own agenda. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. They didn't care about veterans, about justice, about me. They cared about power, about control. I felt sick, angry, betrayed. But more than anything, I felt foolish. I had let myself be used, had believed in a cause that was nothing more than a facade. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, someone I could trust. I reached out to an old friend, someone who had been with me in the army, someone who knew how to dig for dirt and keep secrets. "Marcus," his voice came through the phone, gravelly and reassuring. "What's going on? You sound like you've been through hell." "I need your help, Josh," I said, my voice trembling. "I've stumbled onto something big, something dangerous, and I don't know who to trust anymore." "Tell me everything," he said, his tone serious. "We'll figure this out together." Josh and I worked tirelessly, digging deeper into Greg's connections, tracing the money, following the trails they thought were hidden. We hacked into emails, intercepted calls, pulled up documents that were meant to stay buried. The more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Greg and his associates were involved in more than just manipulating veterans' issues. They were tied to corporations, politicians, media moguls, people who shaped public opinion, who made decisions that affected millions. They were using Lisa's campaign as a front, a way to control the narrative, to push their agenda under the guise of helping veterans. I felt a burning anger, a righteous fury. These people were exploiting my pain, my story, for their gain. They didn't care about justice, about truth. They cared about money, power, control, and they were willing to destroy anyone who got in their way. Josh looked up from his laptop, his face grim. "This is bad, Marcus. Real bad. These people aren't just playing a game. They're running the whole damn show." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. "How do we stop them?" He leaned back, thinking, "We need to expose them. All of them. Get the evidence out there. Yet, to the public. But we have to be smart about it. They've got resources, connections. If we make one wrong move, they'll bury us." I nodded, determination hardening in my chest. "Then we make sure we don't make any mistakes. We gather everything we can, and when we're ready, we hit them where it hurts." We spent weeks gathering evidence, building our case. It was dangerous work, and we had to be careful. Greg's people were watching, and one slip could cost us everything. But we were careful, methodical. We knew that one wrong move could end us, so we planned each step meticulously. We set up hidden cameras, recorded conversations, gathered documents. We had enough evidence to bring down an empire. The day finally came. We held a press conference, inviting journalists, activists, anyone who would listen. I stood at the podium, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. "We've uncovered a conspiracy," I began, my voice steady. "A conspiracy to manipulate public opinion, to control the narrative, to exploit the pain and suffering of veterans for profit. These people don't care about justice, about truth. They care about power, about control, and today we're going to expose them." I presented the evidence, laid out the facts, exposed the lies. The room was silent, the tension palpable. As I spoke, I could see the shock, the disbelief on the faces of the audience. But I also saw something else. Fear. Fear of the truth. Fear of what it meant. Fear of the consequences. Just as I finished, there was a commotion at the back of the room. The doors burst open, and a group of men in suits stormed in, led by Greg himself. He looked furious, his face red, his eyes blazing. "This is a lie!" he shouted, pointing at me. "This man is a fraud, a liar. He's trying to destroy everything we've built." I stood my ground, meeting his gaze. "The only thing we're destroying is your web of lies," I said calmly. "The truth is out, Greg. You can't hide it anymore." The press conference had been a success, but I didn't feel like a winner. The truth was out there, yes, but the battle had only begun. As soon as I stepped off that podium, I could feel the weight of it all crashing down on me. People started questioning, probing, asking for more evidence. Some believed me. Others, though, they weren't so convinced. The media buzzed with headlines about the scandal. My face was plastered all over the news. Veteran exposes corruption was one of the more flattering ones, but not all the press was on my side. The big networks, the ones Greg had his hooks in, began to spin the story. They framed me as a radical, an opportunist, claiming I'd fabricated evidence to gain sympathy. I could see it all unraveling. This was the counterattack. Greg's machine was massive, and now it was coming after me full force. The pressure was mounting. I started losing sleep. Every knock at the door made me jump. Every phone call set my nerves on edge. They were closing in, and I wasn't sure if I could hold on much longer. One night I sat in my dark apartment, staring at the ceiling. I could hear the city outside, car horns, people yelling, the hum of life going on. It felt so distant, like I wasn't part of it anymore. I wondered if I'd gone too far. Maybe I should have kept my head down. Maybe I should have let things slide. But no, I couldn't back down now. I'd come this far, there was no turning back. A week later, I got a tip from one of Josh's contacts. Greg was planning something big, something that would destroy any credibility I had left. Apparently, they had dug up some dirt on me from my time in the military. Nothing serious, just some minor disciplinary actions, things that could easily be spun into a full-blown scandal if they wanted to. I knew this was it, the last move. If I didn't strike first, they would bury me. Josh and I scrambled to come up with a plan. We couldn't just keep defending ourselves. We needed to go on the offensive. But how? Greg was untouchable. He had connections, money, and influence that I couldn't even begin to rival. I thought back to all the people I'd met along the way, all the small voices that had been silenced by people like Greg. I realized I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. This was bigger than me. "We need to take this to the people," I said, pacing back and forth in Josh's cramped office. "We need to bypass the media, the politicians. We need to make sure the public sees them for what they are." Josh nodded, understanding immediately. "We go viral," he said. "We tell the story in a way they can't ignore." So that's what we did. We created videos, testimonies, interviews. We compiled evidence showing how Greg and his cronies had manipulated the system, exploited veterans, and silenced opposition. We blasted it across every social media platform we could find. We mobilized supporters, encouraged people to share their own stories. It was grassroots, but it was powerful. The response was overwhelming. Ordinary people, veterans, activists, even some politicians, started rallying behind us. Greg and his team couldn't control the narrative anymore. They tried to spin it, but the truth was too big, too loud. It was spreading like wildfire. It all came to a head at a televised debate. Greg had agreed to go on air to defend himself, but it was clear he was desperate. His calm, collected demeanor was cracking. I watched from backstage as he fumbled through his talking points, trying to regain control of the situation. I was next. As I walked onto the stage, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was it, the final showdown. The cameras were rolling and millions of eyes were on us. The host asked the first question. "Marcus, you've made some serious allegations against Greg and his associates. Do you really believe this will change anything?" I leaned forward, my eyes locking with Greg's. "It already has," I said. "The truth is out there. People see what's been happening, and they're not going to stand for it anymore." Greg tried to interrupt, but I cut him off. "You've been exploiting people for too long, Greg, and now your time is up." The audience was dead silent, hanging on every word. Greg's face turned red. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a voice from the audience shouted, "You're finished, Greg!" It was one of the veterans who had come forward during our campaign. Then another voice joined in, and another. Soon, the whole audience was chanting, "You're finished! You're finished!" Greg stood there, frozen, his mouth hanging open. He looked around, panicked, like a man watching his world crumble before his eyes. And that's exactly what was happening.